Today we're going to be talking about one of our most important collections, and that is our school desegregation collections. 50,000 pages of material on it in 15 different archives collections. In 1958, Norfolk, Virginia made history by closing 6 of their schools and shutting out 10,000 students to prevent 17 African Americans from being admitted. When Brown v. Board was first passed in '54, Virginia sat back and said, this is going to be overturned. We're not going to worry about it because it's not going to happen. Then when it became apparent that no, the court was quite serious about it and there would be federal backing for it, a series of laws were passed called massive resistance. And these laws were part of something called the Southern Strategy by Senator Byrd, who led the state and the South to, his phrase was, we will do everything we can to massively resist integration. The laws that were passed were bizarre things. They ended compulsory education in the state. As soon as any Negro child goes into a white school, and I'm using, of course, the terminology of the time, the governor can immediately seize control of that school. There was a provision in the law that anyone that didn't want to go to an integrated school could get state funding to go to a private white-only school. These were called segregation academies. And the most important part of the massive resistance laws were that any time any school was integrated, any public school was integrated, the governor immediately could seize control of that and close it. He could hold all the administrative and financial purse strings at that point. In 1958, after a series of lawsuits, the federal court said, you must admit 17 African Americans. Now, up to that point, there'd been a lot of lawsuits. African Americans, through the NAACP, had lawsuits to try to open schools to integrate the schools. Nothing happened. It eventually got through and they said, okay, you've got to admit some. 151 students applied, African American students applied, and the procedure for applying to get into a white school was there had to be an interview. Kids would go in alone to a group of white people who, I'm taking a wild guess, were not that friendly, and be interviewed with questions like, where's your dad work? Have you had experience in integrated settings? Which is pretty odd in a society where there was almost no integrated settings. Are you a troublemaker? Do you hate white people? Have you been in trouble with the law? African Americans had to go through not only that, but they had to go through rigorous testing, 2 different sets of tests. And after all of that, the school board came back and said, court, it's the most amazing things. None of these students were good enough to be in the white schools. They published their names in the newspaper with a list of why each of these kids wasn't good enough. Here are the kids that failed scholastically. Here are the kids that had a bad background. Here's the kids for this. They took it to the court, and the court said, you know what, we're not feeling it. Come back with us again because you will integrate. Finally, they picked 17 students that they would allow into the schools. And it's not clear why they picked those 17 students. I know some of those students, and they said they thought maybe they were lighter skins. And then they looked around and said, well, no, looking at us, that's not it. Maybe we had last names that sounded more something. Nobody could quite figure it out, but those 17 were picked. The same day that they were admitted, the governor sent a letter saying, because you admitted those students, we are shutting down those 6 schools that you would admit black students to. Immediately, 10,000 students were locked out for 5 months, the biggest closing in US history to prevent integration. Some of them went to private tutoring schools. Some of them gave up, if they were 16, 17, they joined the Navy. Students just never went back. Some went to neighboring schools. For those 17 students, African American students, they were tutored, rigorously tutored, in a school set up at Butte Street First Baptist Church and taught not only high school courses, but how to deal with what life would be like when they went to that white school, how to deal with the pressure and the hostility, how to get through it. White parents brought a suit in Norfolk claiming unequal protection because they weren't allowed into the schools. It was the only case in the South where white students and white parents fought to get schools opened to integrate, and that opened the schools here. On the same day, a federal court and a state court ruled that most massive resistance laws were unconstitutional and voided them. The problem was that then strategies just changed. Things happened like Virginia Beach started so that students didn't have to go to integrated schools in Norfolk. So things did not start changing until there was busing for racial balance. Busing started in most places in the early 70s. There were no students in all single race schools. There were about 10% of students were in schools that had 80% one race. But basically you had true integration. There weren't all black schools and all white schools. In the early 80s or mid 80s, Norfolk decided to get rid of busing for racial balance for elementary students and introduced what they called neighborhood schools. Norfolk, like many other communities, has residential segregation. If you don't bus students, then you have kids just going to schools in communities that are single race. Studies showed that segregation is bad. They showed it in the 30s, and those studies influenced Brown v. Board. They showed it in the 1990s. They looked at Norfolk and saw that those kids that went to single race schools had much lower test scores than integrated schools. And yet, soon after that study came out and it was well publicized, Portsmouth, our neighboring community, decided they would stop busing for racial balance. When students come in here, and I tell them that it was once illegal for you to be sitting next to that classmate, well, yeah, they know about civil rights. They've read about it. It doesn't make any sense to them. So that's pretty wonderful that things have changed so much that they can't imagine it. What hasn't changed is that they're still very poor schools, they're wealthier schools, and because busing for racial balance ended, they're now all black schools and all white schools. This city has become resegregated, as have a lot of cities around the country that no longer bus for racial balance. So you've got residential segregation. And segregation is still an evil. It still causes problems. It means people can't adjust well in society if they've only dealt with one race. We're at our richest when we have a diverse culture, when we have a diverse student body, diverse administration,